Hello again, everyone. I'm Rob Johnson, president of Rob Johnson Communications.
And I'm Eileen Rochford, CEO of the marketing and strategy firm, The Harbinger Group. Since communications strategy is our bread and butter here at Can You Hear Me? And there have been so many issues surrounding that topic related to the biggest news in the world right now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we thought it was important to devote an episode to this topic.
That's right, Eileen. And there are many topics of conversation on this front. The first one that comes to mind is the way the world has looked at Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the one-time comedian, now leading his country against Russia's brutal dictator, Vladimir Putin. And truly, Zelenskyy's introduction to the world, I think, came when the U.S. offered to come get him and fly him into exile. And Zelenskyy famously said, quote, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition," which meant he was staying to fight side by side with his fellow Ukrainians. And so think about this, Eileen, as your introduction really on the world stage. I know people, diplomats and people that follow government knew who Zelenskyy was, but the world didn't. And that's really the first thing we heard about was, I'm not looking for a ride. I need ammunition. I'm staying to fight. And he would post these various videos that were very powerful and they were down to earth and people could relate to it. And now it feels like, in a polarized world that we live in, where politics, some people are looking at things one way, some people are looking at things the other. I'm not saying everybody's on the side of Ukraine, but a large number of people are on the side of Ukraine, and who can blame them?
Yeah, they have, and he in particular, have captured the hearts and minds of so many, at least here on our side of the world. We see that over and over. There's no doubt about it. It's a very compelling situation and a compelling story. It's got a lot of complexities to it as well, just the situation overall, which I think, we all appreciate that, right? Nothing is as simple as it may seem. And there's so much going on here beneath it all and behind the scenes that we don't see. But in terms of the storyline and where people's positions on this are falling, he himself and his actions have captured, as I said, hearts and minds. It's hard not to side with Ukraine when they're so small and Russia's so big, and the atrocities that are being committed are being shown every single day on our small screens and our big screens, and the headlines are just dominating everything that we look at. It's hard not to really be affected by this.
No, you're absolutely right. And you think about somebody like Putin, who is president. He's democratically elected, and I'm using air quotes. You can't see that on a podcast, but it's like he's tried a little bit more and a little bit more, and seeing what happens if I push the envelope in Crimea and other places, and now Ukraine. And listen, whether it's obvious or not, and I think it's probably pretty obvious. I mean, here's somebody that would love to have the Soviet Union back, and that would be an absolutely awful idea on many fronts, most of which we don't have time to get into today. Yeah. But this thing in Ukraine, people might say, well, it's Ukraine. It's so small, as you pointed out. But no, you can't allow this to happen. What's to say he's not going to go, all right, I'm going to keep going to Poland. I'm going to go, hey, look, Sweden or Finland. And now I'm kind of, being a little farcical, but not really, because this is what NATO was created for, except the guy that was in charge in Germany, Hitler, who created the most unthinkable atrocities in the history of the world. That's who it was created for. And now we have this guy, and people are seeing him for what he truly is, Vladimir Putin I'm talking about.
Right. That's absolutely right. From a leadership standpoint, and we talk about that a lot on this show, right?
Right.
What Zelenskyy has done, despite his background as being a comedian, people talk about that a lot, but I think that there's a lot more to this man than was appreciated prior to this point. He just demonstrates all of the right qualities. It's almost like a masterclass in leadership style and communication style, really just following along with how he's handling the situation and how he's standing up for all that he and his country value, and the way that he's telling the world, this is what they need, and this is what's required. And he's not, settling for good enough. He wants everything. And I think that that's very admirable, but his leadership style is something that I know lots of people are following closely and paying much attention to. I'm seeing it written about almost on a daily basis now on LinkedIn. The attributes that he's exhibiting are just textbook in terms of excellence in leadership and communications.
But I think the subtext here, Eileen, and you make some great points there, and this is not to disparage comedians at all. It's to say, here's a guy that's having a really horrible thing happen to his country. He is the president of this country, and here's a former comedian. And so you're thinking, oh, he's a funny guy, and so maybe the bar is a little bit low when it comes to diplomacy, not necessarily to the career that he chose initially. So again, please, I don't want anybody to mistake what I'm saying here. But the other part of it is the reason that he's probably so good at some of these other things that you're talking about when it comes to messaging and when it comes to winning hearts and minds is, he's an actor. And I'm not saying he's faking it, but he understands messaging and he understands how powerful it is, and he is making use of it, and the world is following along. And he also knows there are other people that he may see as opportunists who are Western leaders who are like, oh yeah, we're all in. Well, what are you doing to help me? Are you
show me?
You're getting a no-fly zone? You're going to do a no-fly zone? You're going to help me with, I need ammunition. I need drones. I need, rocket launcher, whatever the case is. Are you going to put your money where your mouth is? Because we all know politicians have a lot to say, but if you really want to help him, it's what you do. And I think that he's able to I think he's able to balance that pretty well here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your comment, put your money where your mouth is. He came out of the gate with that stance and didn't quit. And he's firing that every single day. I think because of that, that's why so quickly the temperature heated up on people's expectations of, so what are the world's leaders going to do? And and that does not just mean political or elected officials. It also means the world's leaders, as we've talked about extensively on recent episodes, now, really rests with corporations and the leadership within those, particularly Fortune 100 corporations. So the pressure on corporations to quit doing business in and with Russia, even if it's temporary, as we've seen, has been the highest, at least in my lifetime. I've never witnessed anything like this. I don't know if you have.
It's overwhelming. It is. It's big, and it's clear.
Very clear. There's a recent poll by Morning Consult found that 75% of U.S. adults support corporations stopping business dealings in Russia, temporarily or permanently. And more than 76% of them also want companies to donate to causes that support the Ukrainian people who are suffering because of this aggression. It also found that 73% of companies speaking out in support of Ukraine, in addition to their actions, is something that people are expecting. And there are different reasons for such high numbers, but from the corporations themselves that have quit doing business in Russia, for the time being, there's so many of them. Let's just go through a few to give folks a picture of the magnitude of this movement. So there's marquee names like ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Apple, Google, Meta, former Facebook, McDonald's, shipping giants like UPS and FedEx. And according to a recent Forbes article, a lot of these decisions are based upon these corporations' desires not to repeat the mistakes of guilt by association dating back to Nazi Germany, saying, quote, "Today's corporations do not want the moral stain of the World War II era German companies who tacitly supported the Nazis. Instead, they are stepping into the role of socially responsible corporate leaders that the modern era demands." And we've talked about that quite a bit on this show. So let's talk about that within the lens of this situation. I'm personally, I'm pleased to see it because it just feels to me, with my personal moral compass, like the right thing to do. in my value system. Others have, varying opinions on this, but as a professional communicator, I believe that companies are more aware than ever, and we've seen this in lots of research that we've gone over in prior episodes. They're more aware than ever of the public expectation element that impacts their brand, but they're also really aware at the highest leadership level that the decisions they make are not just about how they run their business, how much money they make, who they employ, their benefits packages, all the typical things anymore. And there's no dialing back on that. As they say, the train's left the station. So leadership has had to adapt, and I'm pleased that so many of these companies and more, the ranks are growing by day, just are recognizing that, and at a minimum are doing things like looking to see if their finances are in any way connected to dealings in Russia. Mm-hmm. And they're doing that due diligence to figure it out, because maybe they didn't know, right? But they're realizing, wow, we better go find out, because we need to know that. We don't want to be caught either back-footed on this without an answer, or maybe caught unknowingly with ties to money that does originate in some way or within Russia, and we're not okay with that. So they're going to find out. Those are some of the things that I've observed. How about you, Rob?
I think what's really important to add to this part of the conversation, Eileen, is that, Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, Soviet Union crumbles, and it becomes all these different countries, which is what it is today. And all of a sudden, Russia is a great place. It's by virtue not only of its geography, but a lot of other, big cities and things of that nature. It's a great place to do business. And I think a lot of these companies, aside from the fact that, yes, times are different and expectations are higher for leaders to show that leadership and to take a stand on these things, I would not be surprised if some of these people up until recently maybe didn't see didn't see what Putin was doing here. They were thinking, okay, we're with Russia, we're doing business there. It's a part of the world that we need to have a footprint, and they did. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden you're going, oh gosh, this guy is completely authoritarian. We knew he had these traits. He was predisposed to this perhaps, but we didn't see it coming like this. And now, yes, are we invested there? Yes, we're doing business there. Are we pulling out? What are we doing? And I think some of these decisions, I would be surprised if a lot of these places, not that they were blind to it, about some of these, some of these aggressions that occurred before. And now we're not talking about aggression. We're talking about invasions, and we're talking about atrocities and things that are just absolutely awful. But they went from maybe being a little leery, maybe being moderately leery, to being, oh my gosh, we got to get out of here. I think this happened pretty quickly from a corporate perspective. And I know that they have intel, and I'm not saying that all of a sudden they looked in one day and said, oh gosh, like the rest of the world did, what's this? I know that they have better strategy than that. However, all of a sudden you're having to make these changes on a dime. We're not doing business there. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, say, let me give an example, like McDonald's pulls out. Well, guess what? In Russia, they're still open for business under something else. It's not using any of the protocols or any of that sort of thing, but they're able to, think about some of these planes that they had to abandon planes in Russia, and Russia's like, we're just keeping them. Right. You're thinking, wow.
Okay, they're ours. Thank you.
I mean, yeah. So those are some examples, but I think this happened pretty swiftly from a corporate standpoint, and not only from the corporate standpoint, but from the reaction they got from the world, which was get out of there, go. Mm-hmm. You can't stand up there. This is, there is no gray area here. This is bad. What's going on there is bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really appreciate the point you have me thinking, your point about essentially globalism, right? The expansion of globalism, which occurred in 30-ish years, right? At a rapid rate that I don't think people were necessarily, and I don't mean corporations here, I just mean people, people like you and me, certainly aware of all of those implications, right, of globalism. Right. And then all of a sudden here we are, and this happens, and it's not just about really horrible leader of a major country, in the world, and how that leader is behaving. But it's also about all the finances that have become wrapped up in that country. And
Yes.
Whoa, how does a company pivot in when situations like that arise? What's interesting to me is the timing. So we've just had and seen 2+ years of all sizes of companies, Fortune 100s down to, the smallest and sole proprietor businesses, having to learn so fast. How do I pivot? How do I learn how to adapt? Right. So it's almost like we're in this more nimble mindset of expectation too, and learning to be able to do the pivot and the communications that go along with the pivot. And I wonder if that,
agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if that had something to do with just these numbers that I was citing earlier. That's really, really high, 75%, and north of that is an extraordinary, overwhelming percentage of people who expect action on the issue, right? Well, maybe that's a product of how fast companies delivered on pivot and change and communications in the last 2 years. So you have to consider that what's the impact really of these past 2 years is going to be long standing. Like people aren't, again, we're not going to dial back. It's okay. We knew, or we saw that you could do it, and we saw that you could act quickly. You could communicate quickly. You were more empathetic. You were all these things, said corporation, said employer, that you hadn't been before, though maybe we wanted you to be.
Right.
You proved that you could. So here we are, this new situation arises, one of several massive issues that have come up and faced us all in the last 2 years. And the people, whether it's consumers and employees, et cetera, are speaking and saying, we want better. So I just wonder if it's, that level of expectation might be born a little bit out of what we all went through and saw, and the successful way in which even the hugest of companies was able to steer the ship quickly.
I think there's no question. And, I was bringing it up a couple of minutes ago, Eileen, about not only corporations having to make quick decisions, but the reaction they're getting from their employees about what they need to do, which speaks to the things that we talk about all the time, which we've already referenced a couple of times here, about the changing expectations of the workforce and the fact that the workforce at any company now has a voice. Before it was trickle down. It was, hey, I'm the CEO, I'm preaching from the mountaintop, and here's what we're doing. And it trickled downhill, right? Mm-hmm. to the rank and file workers. It's not the way it works anymore. We both know that. We both know that to be an effective CEO, you have to really have your finger on the pulse of what's going on inside your company, and that things work their way. They go from ground up now in a lot of ways. And if you're not providing that leadership, then you're getting left behind. So I think it's just another, it started off with how they're communicating during COVID, which we talk a lot about. Then it was, the CEO brand building. It's expectations of millennials who are now in positions of authority, who expect different things from the places that they work and the leaders who lead those places where they work. And now it's international affairs. It's, here's a bad guy from a country, Vladimir Putin, absolutely committing atrocities, invading a country, causing not only a refugee crisis, but people are, obviously loss of life, destruction, the whole bit. And it's so egregious. It's so right there in front of you. You cannot ignore it. And I think that's just another iteration of what is expected of a corporate leader in this day and age. I truly believe that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt about it. And it doesn't help that this is the first, we'll say Western-ish, at least in European conflict that has played out in social media. And that's a real tough thing to deal with too, because it's not like you're only going to hear it a couple times a day. You're going to hear it all day, every day, and you're going to see it. It's going to be pushed to you, and all of that stuff is, it affects people's psyches. Like, you really can't deny that it's going to impact people who work at your company in a lot of different dimensions, psychologically, kind of like the situation that they had to deal with throughout COVID too. That you just can't lead in a vacuum anymore, or with blinders on. Like, everything is connected, as they say. So witnessing this play out on social media, I think, is another dimension that we have to consider, and the impact of that is great. So leaders have to not just keep their finger on the pulse, but they've got to recognize it's going to change day to day based on what's being reported, based on what people are seeing, and, find that balance between tail wagging the dog and dog wagging the tail, as I say.
And the pictures, and you talked about them. There's no denying what's going on. I mean, you see the pictures on an hourly basis, what's going on in Ukraine. And those speak louder than any words that anybody else is speaking. But these, listen, these are tough times again for no more importantly than the people of Ukraine, but also for, since we talk about communication and we talk about company leaders and things of that nature. It's never been more important for them, because so many people are seeing what's going on, and so many people are saying this is wrong. And, when it comes to corporate activism, things have changed perceptively, than they might have been years ago, as we were just talking about it. So companies and brands have always had to be careful about straddling the proverbial fence. Forbes is here. They've reported that CEOs are reluctant to be the public face of their organizations or engage in corporate activism. Well, now it's saying they should consider the results of a new poll that found people who want the top company executives to be visible and expect them to speak out on controversial issues and topics. We've talked about it before. We've talked about be authentic to your brand. If you don't speak out on this, don't do it. If this is something you weigh in on, typically, then weigh in on it. But I think the rules may be a little bit different here. Citing information from one of our favorite sources, the 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer, which we've referenced on this show multiple times, 81% believe CEOs should be personally visible when discussing public policy with external stakeholders or the work their company has done to benefit society. So here's what we're doing, and here's how we're making the world a better place. They want their CEO out front and center talking about those issues. 60% said that when considering a job, they expect the CEOs to speak out publicly about controversial social and political issues that prospective employees care about. So there's overwhelming data here. 81%, that's huge. And if you got 81% of anything, you say, okay, that's overwhelming. 60%, also a very high number as well. This data is suggesting that not only what your workforce wants from you, but what they expect from you. So we've already touched on it a little bit, but I really like the Trust Barometer putting some numbers, some data around this and talking about this really is important. This isn't just two people on this podcast, Rob and Eileen, giving their opinion about something. This is backed up by data.
Yeah. As I like to say a couple of times now, the train's left the station, right? There's no pretending that you can lead without recognizing the impact and implications and effects of world issues, even just national issues, on your people and on the way that you do business, and on any CEO's public brand. It's got to be factored in, and the decision has to be made at the highest level. What issues make sense for us to talk about, and what is our position? And at a minimum, be prepared to answer the questions when you get them. Whether it's in town hall meetings, and it may not be on the agenda, but it can very well come up. And so being prepared and recognizing that even internal conversations have the possibility of being, replayed outside, whether you're a private company or not, that information can get outside. So be thoughtful about it. And don't stick your head in the sand and pretend, oh, that's not going to come up here. I don't need to worry about that. You do. You not only need to be prepared with some kind of canned statement, but make sure that it's thoughtful and that you vetted it with your trusted members of your leadership team and treated it as the serious matter, that it really is, well ahead of a time when you might be tested through a question from internal or external sources. That's my advice.
And I think too, and I brought it up a second ago, typically, I think, Eileen, you and I, as communications professionals dealing with various clients, would say, don't do something that's not authentic to you. Don't weigh in on something if that's not what you typically do as a company. I would say here, and this is just us talking here, so I don't have, 37% say this or 50. I would say that this is so, the response has been so overwhelmingly positive toward Ukraine and negative toward Russia that I wonder, I'd be interested to know how many companies are out there who normally don't weigh in on something, but they're facing so much internal pressure. You were just talking about how you share it internally, how that internal pressure might create, somebody weighing in on something they don't normally do. The response would be authentic. The fact that they never do this may not be authentic. So I just wanted to raise that point because I think it's interesting that normally you and I would say to a company, well, is this something that you normally would talk about? No. Yeah. Okay. Then you should probably sit this one out like you do every other one. Or if you have a more of an activist sort of company that's one of your clients and they say, well, we want to weigh in on this. And you're like, well, that's what you do and you have weighed the pros and the cons, then you should do that. I think now there is tremendous pressure, no matter what kind of company you run, in terms of, do we talk about social issues? Do we talk about what's going on in the world, or we just keep our mouths shut? There is pressure to say something, even if it's not something that's in your comfort zone.
Yeah. On this particular topic, it is a really interesting thing to think about. So let's pause there for a second and play it through. It's an international issue. It is dominating the news feeds literally everywhere. And it doesn't have to do with, an incident that happened here, like the racial unrest, the murder of George Floyd, the things that came out of that. For some reason, that was, I guess it is, that was such a horrible thing. Every time I think about it, honestly, and all of those murders, so sad, so wrong. But for some reason, that's a lightning rod type of issue here in the United States. And we don't need to dissect the why behind all that now, but I'm bringing it up purely as contrast. This situation of aggression and war being forced on Ukraine does not seem to be a lightning rod type of issue in any of the same ways. It's almost unifying in the volume of people, companies who are standing up to say, this is wrong. This is why we feel it's wrong. And more importantly, we're going to vote with our wallet here. And even if we lose planes, lose millions and millions of dollars in revenue, it doesn't matter to us because this is wrong and we're not going to be a part of it. It's a unifying moment, much more so than it is kind of lightning rod. There's a significant contrast, right, in the difference between this event and many other terrible things we've seen over the last 2 years, even. You would agree, right? I
agree 100%. And I brought this up earlier in the podcast, talking about, we as a country can't agree on anything. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but most everybody, I think that this is a fairly unifying issue, as you just pointed out. So I think you made a really terrific point there, and diving in a little deeper and talking about it, because we can't agree on anything. We are polarized as a society. That, it's half the people think this way, half the people think that way. And I'm not saying there aren't some people out there that are saying, hey, I'm pro Russia and Putin, but you gotta probably say a little quieter now than you once did.
Totally.
If you are, because people are going to eviscerate you if you are, because again, we see the pictures. The problem with, having facts and having them work in your favor and having people, kind of parse things in different ways is the pictures are so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. It's war, it's aggression, it's atrocities, and we see it. There's, people can say, well, what you're seeing is nobody can spin this. Everything's spun so much in this country, even January 6th. And I don't want to get into that other than to say, oh, that what you saw, you didn't see that. And it's like, wait a minute. This is war. We all know what it looks like. We all know what's happening in Ukraine. Obviously, we're not as close to it as people that are dealing with it on the front lines every day, losing their loved ones, having to escape Ukraine, go to Poland or wherever. The number of refugees and everything is just mind numbing. But we know what we're saying. We know what we're saying. And there's nobody out there. There's no cable outlet saying, well, what you're seeing is, or maybe Vladimir Putin's cable outlets are doing that. But the rest of the world, we know what we see. Period.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the flip side of that is we also know that there is manipulation of information happening in some tragic ways. And the bots and the evildoers, it's such a funny phrase. I feel like I'm 80. I just said that. But the manipulation still is happening. So I just want to say, I'm just saying it to say it, because I've had a few instances come up recently where I've had some articles presented to me on this topic where, after a few minutes of scrutiny, I realized, no, I think those photos are doctored. And no, I think that not only did this come from a somewhat sketchy, maybe news outlet, or, not immediately recognizable. But, you put those two things together and it made me, again, we all operate in bubbles, whether we know it or not, So I would need to take the moment, and I'm taking moments all the time now to encourage everybody to think about and question things that they see, because, and not only when it doesn't agree with their, point of view, also when it agrees with your point of view, dig into it, because the world's being manipulated every single minute of every single day. And we're seeing, extremism rise out of that. That's very dangerous and very scary. So I'm just going to say, yes, we can't deny, because of the volume of reporting that's happening on the ground, mainly from real people's camera phone footage. That's the stuff that you just, you're seeing so much of it that in the news crews, they can't be everywhere, but the people are everywhere. And what they're putting up really is scary. But at the same time, continue to be vigilant in your caution of accepting information at face value, because that is something, we were just talking about how it took, 35 years for globalism, to reach this pace. While at the same time, the internet was taking hold, social media was escalating, and that is still happening. In the pace of manipulation of information now is even worse than it was 2 years ago. So sorry to take us off track a little bit, but
no,
I just think
it's not really taking us off track. It's reaffirming things we've talked about in other podcasts before, which is know the source where you're getting the information. So important. And I will say this, and this is not a comment about the political leanings of any cable outlet or any network or whatever, but if you're investing the people power in sending people to cover a war in a war zone, and they are there, they are going to be reliable. And if you got somebody in their PJs in the basement, spreading lies, totally different. Although you probably don't know they're in their PJs in the basement spreading lies. But the point is, if you have boots on the ground in terms of reporting on an hourly basis and being able to tell all these stories, you should consider those people a little bit more reliable than some of these other, chameleons.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rob. I'm glad you made that. And recognizing that journalists are also giving their lives in this conflict. Yeah. And that's tragic. Every
and
time
it happens in every one of them. And, having been in some hot spots in the past in my former life as a TV anchor and reporter, that's a real commitment. And I have a ton of respect, and I always will. I don't care what outlet they work at. If you are there and you are ducking, bombs and shootings and everything else, then you are doing the greatest public service that you can do in the business of journalism. Yeah,
that's no doubt about it. 100% true. So, and I'm grateful for all the reporting that's coming to us from news sources in Ukraine. And I think about those people a lot, just like I do all the soldiers and the poor folks who are
absolutely
homeless and terrified for their lives every minute now because of what's been done. I know we wanted to talk about one more aspect of this, really from a communications perspective, and that is the issue of how companies handle talking about Russia's attack on Ukraine internally with their employees. So we've talked about some of the external approaches and implications and things to factor in when you're considering what is your country's or company's position and how or if you should communicate externally. Now let's talk about how companies can talk about this internally with their employees, particularly employees who may be struggling with processing this information. According to a recent report, this one was from Zenefits. It suggests putting together internal communications kind of as needed, acknowledging, this is happening, offering, safe space discussions for employees to share, how they might be affected by these incidents and how they might be feeling. The report also indicated the value in offering up a list of Ukraine aid organizations. Sometimes employees might feel like, well, I want to do something. Well, you can be really helpful as an employer and provide a list of those organizations where folks can give monetary donations or volunteer their time to help, load planes that are sending humanitarian goods, things like that. Also, maybe thinking about, is this a good time to use one of your employee pulse surveys to gauge, the mood of the workforce, the impact on them, and to identify the in-house support ideas that you might want to provide. This is just another moment where empathy and understanding and support is needed, particularly on the heels of everything your employees and all of us have gone through in the last 2 years, right? This isn't just an isolated single event. It's another event in a series of many that have each on their own been terribly challenging and traumatizing in different ways for people, right? So this is the snowball effect that's in play here. It's not just, this war, which is bad enough in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So, seeing that for what it is, if this war had kind of come without all of the preceding incidents, maybe companies wouldn't need to be as concerned about their employees' mental health. But because it is one in a series of so many traumatizing things, I think it's particularly important to stay on top of that and not do it as lip service or just once or twice, but, consistently evaluate and pay closer attention, and then provide what could be helpful, communicate how to access it. Those are additional things that companies and leadership teams can think about right now. What do you think, Rob?
And I know that employees' mental health is of great concern to you as a company leader. You talk about it all the time. And this is yet another example of being that empathetic leader, paying attention to what's going on right in front of you, understanding that people process things differently. And yes, what's happened the last 2 years, having to deal with all of that, which was completely unique and there was no playbook for it, and it was being created on the fly. And now you have this, and you have people that are coming out of the pandemic and thinking, all right, whatever the future of my workflow is going to be, we're now implementing it. We're now doing it. And then you have this, and it's yet another, it's hard to process. It's hard to watch. It's hard to see those pictures, and how do people react to it on the heels of all the things they've dealt with. And so what you're doing is you're communicating a message. You are acknowledging a shared experience, which makes people feel more safe. And you're also giving them an outlet. I love the idea of some people need to just have the internal communications, perhaps. And other people might need to say, here are 5 not-for-profits that are donating, if not all, most of their money for Ukrainian aid to help the people that have been displaced, that are now refugees, they're going to have to rebuild at some point, all sorts of different places. And I want to give you one example that I loved, and it was from one of my best clients that I've been working for several years now. And I'm there so much. They're like, well, you're kind of part of the family, even though I'm a consultant. Right. And they said, you know what, for this thing, we're doing a matching gift for Ukraine aid. And Rob, you're part of the deal. We're going to match whatever you donate. We're going to match it. It's like you're an employee, even though you're not. So it was even an acknowledgement of somebody like me, who's a contractor, right? Saying, I know this is hard for everybody, and you're part of something, and we're going to match whatever you, so now my wife and I had talked about, like, what are we going to do? And I started asking around, like, what's a good charity to donate to? And then I knew that, and it gave me even more incentive to do it, because I was like, well, I'm going to double whatever I do. It's going to double. And it was, it was great incentive. And it made me feel like part of something, even though I don't work there. I work there, but I'm not a full-time employee. And they're like, we're just going to, for this, we're just going to, you're considered an employee. We're going to let you, we're going to match whatever you donate. Just show us what it is and what their 501c3 is, and we're good to go. I thought it was terrific.
Nice. Yeah. You mentioned, for some people, the internal communication will be enough. And the providing kind of that safe space for conversation is something that others might need. I think sometimes those actions can serve as like release valves a little bit for people, like emotionally, like, okay, I'm not alone. Everybody, I work with, or who I interact with every day, is also seeing this communication. They may also be feeling this. Those release valve type of communications and activities can be really, really important and helpful.
Shared experience. People. We're sharing this experience, and we process it differently. I think it's a great point. Yeah,
totally. For others, even, if you can't do a matching type of donation, say maybe you're a smaller company. I know of one who's doing something that I thought was so both just wonderful and creative. They found a connection to pilots who are donating their time to fly planes over with humanitarian aid. And they're organizing, like, every 2 weeks, they are accepting donations of various goods, which they communicated out to all their customers, the people who come in and out of this business, their suppliers, their partners, of the types of things that are most in need. And they're storing them at their business. And then every 2 weeks, they take a truck, they fill it with as much as they can, and they get it to the plane site and help load the plane. And then they know they've literally made a tangible contribution to things that are going to help people, directly. And they're kind of rallying together around it. Something that's also important.
Feel like they're doing something. It makes them feel like they're empowered to help. And even though it may be a small way, it's still helping. It's still pulling in the right direction.
And it's a small business, I don't know, less than 100 employees, but they happen to have one person on staff who moved to Chicago from Ukraine probably 10 years ago. Her family is still there, and her whole family, all her siblings, her parents, their children, all of it. And she's hearing reports, as much as, they're able to communicate with her, about the impact and the terrifying situation that they're all enduring, and relaying that. And she had to take a little bit of leave. She couldn't handle it emotionally, and rightly so. Right.
It's understandable. Yeah.
But I just love that her colleagues decided to do something on such a large scale that's requiring not just their money, but also their time. The Absolutely. Managing of the storing of all the materials, accepting the donations, the transport of it. It's pretty great. So in cases where businesses maybe don't have reserves and the ability to do financial type matches or donations, sure. Organizing something for your employees to participate in is also another terrific option. Yeah, that can be.
You just want to feel
have a
part
great
of
impact.
You want to feel part of doing good for people that deserve to have it done for them.
Yeah. And it's a visible demonstration. Again, that expectation that customers and employees have now of brands, of companies, that they take some level of activism, social activism, despite the fact that they're, air quotes, just a company. It's real. So it's across the board that fulfills a lot of those expectations we were talking about.
No doubt. No doubt. Great points all.
So I think we are coming to the conclusion of another great discussion. Hopefully we've provided some good guidance, advice, some provoking of new thoughts and ideas that our listeners can take on with them throughout their couple of weeks till we get back together again.
Absolutely.
So that's going to do it for another edition of Can You Hear Me? I'm Eileen Rochford, CEO of the Harbinger Group.
And I'm Rob Johnson, president of Rob Johnson Communications. We thank you for listening as always. And remember, you can listen to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Google, Spotify, and more. Thanks for listening.